So when you heard the President and Vice President of the United States talk about a 2-week lockdown, what were your initial thoughts on that?
I don't know that I had any particular thoughts. I accepted it. They said 2 weeks to slow the spread. I just took it at face value. Okay, we'll follow this for a few weeks. I didn't necessarily think 2 weeks was going to be the end of it. And I honestly felt that that the president should have found a whole lot more information before there was any lockdown. I felt it was too spur of the moment. It was too spontaneous. It was too sudden. It just didn't reflect a carefully thought out plan. And I thought more time would have revealed the truth about the seriousness of the illness. And as it turned out, as time went on, the rate of death was not anywhere near what they said it was. And if they had waited a while, I think it would have been much different. So I don't know that I had any initial reaction other than to say, I think this is way too soon. I wish they wouldn't take these kind of severe actions so quickly without really understanding what's going to happen.
Yeah. When you guys were in that elder meeting, was everybody on the same page right away, or were there some disagreements? Was there some debate about what you should do concerning this lockdown?
I think we were sort of on the same page because of those two things that I mentioned. We knew people were afraid, and we didn't want to heighten their fear. I mean, if people are afraid to come out of the house and they're afraid to come and gather with other people, what is the point in demanding that they come to church? We don't do that. So we would defer to that, understanding that we didn't have all the information, but also believing in our hearts that this was not what it was being sold to be. And I wasn't looking at some political strategy or some conspiracy theory. I just thought it was way overblown. And as I said earlier, that's because I believe God has wired us to live together and share our germs so that we build robust immunity. So I thought it was counterintuitive to everything I know about how God created society to function. But once the medical people said, there's going to be a whole lot of sick people, they're going to fill up all the hospital beds, and the people in our church are afraid of these things, and by then they were told to stay home. There was no way we were going to put a burden on the people by asking them to go against what was being told and elevate their fear. That wouldn't make for a sensible worship experience or fellowship in any case.
Tell me, why does the elder board have to be unanimous?
Well, years ago when we first started to put the elder ministry together, we said from the very beginning that God has one will. Okay, he's not confused about anything, so it's up to us as a board of elders to come to an understanding of the purpose and the will of God. And that means we all need to be on the same page. You're not going to have unity in the church if you don't have unity in leadership. I mean, this is all over the epistles, that we are to be united. We're to be in one spirit and one mind. And so it has to start with leadership. And I also lived long enough in the church in my life to realize that churches split when there's discord at the leadership level. And the way you protect a church from splitting is to make sure that you have unity at the top. So from the very beginning of my ministry here, we said the decisions of the elders, which are the defining decisions of life in the church, are going to all be unanimous. And if somebody's not there, then we wait and we talk more and we give more evidence and we listen and we figure it out. But in the end, we all affirm it so that you don't have a split group of leaders who then can make a division in the congregation. That's very counterproductive. I think of all the things that we've done in the church at Grace Community Church, nothing has contributed to the unity of this church like the unity of the elders. When there's unanimity at that level, there's nowhere to go to find dissent at the leadership level. And dissent is only effective in a church when it can attach itself to leadership. So if the leaders agree, you really have the way forward. And so that's always been our approach. And sometimes it means we can't make a decision this week. We have to meet again, or we have to talk again, or we have to get on the phone, or we have to help each other understand it. And once in a while, we'll find that the dissenters had it right, and we'll all kind of move to their side of the issue. But it preserves the integrity of that board, the unity of that board, which preserves the unity of the church.
Yeah, so it's basically what is an elder-ruled church?
Sure.
If you were to explain to somebody who's never, has no clue about that kind of
Right.
thing, explain that to me.
We go to the New Testament for everything in terms of the life and order of the church. And we learn this as the basic structure of the church. Christ is the head of the church. He is the head of the church. It's repeated over and over again in the New Testament. There's no human being that's the head of the church. The Pope is not the head of the church. The cardinals aren't the head of the church. No bishop is the head of the church. Not even a pastor is the head of the church. Christ is the head of the church. So if Christ is the head of the church, he then mediates his rule in the church. He rules. The church is the kingdom of Christ. So how does he mediate his rule? In the New Testament, he mediates his rule through mature, godly preachers and teachers who are called pastors because they have a shepherding role, a leadership role, who are also called teachers or preachers because they have a teaching role, and who are called bishops or overseers because they have an administrative role. So you have the term bishop, and you have the term pastor, and you have the term teacher, but the one qualification that covers all of it is elder, which is to say, the people who are in those positions need to be mature. The term elder, it's actually the Greek word presbyteros, from which Presbyterian comes, because Presbyterian churches have that form of government. So Christ mediates his rule through those who are most skilled in handling his word and have the most wisdom based on the most experience. You collect those men together. Elder is simply a way to define their maturity. And the New Testament uses elder as opposed to someone who's young. In fact, the New Testament is explicit. It says, don't put a novice in a leadership position like that. You need to have someone who is mature. It even lays out all the qualifications for someone who is a pastor, overseer, teacher, elder in the church. So that is the New Testament pattern. And then they are the ones that set the course, expressing the will of God as it comes through the Word of God to the life of the church.
There are people that say, you guys need to repent for locking down in the first place. You shouldn't have done that. So what would you say to that person?
Well, if I had a bunch of friends and I was walking down a railroad track and somebody came along the road and said, by the way, there's a train coming about a minute away, and it's headed right down this track, I would say, well, let's get off the track. If it turned out the train never showed up, I still would have done the right thing. So I'm not going to put my congregation in the crosshairs of some kind of deadly plague. So obviously, if there are doomsday reports of what this is going to do to people, it makes common sense that I'm not going to be foolish and culpable for putting people in a position for putting people in some kind of situation where they're going to get very, very ill. So it was the obvious thing to do. And anybody who would say to do differently might have a hard time convincing people that they're a protective person, because there are some threats you just take action. And when you don't have all the information, there was really no choice. We weren't going to defy things until we knew that this was not what they said it was going to be. We would have done the same thing if the government had not said it, but some local medical group had said there's a terrible virus in the community, you need to keep your people home for a few weeks. We would have done that. This isn't bowing to government in the life of the church. This is just being protective. And I think you have to understand, look, as a pastor, I have a number of responsibilities, but right at the top of the list is protecting people. A shepherd is a provider, and he is a protector. And I'm not going to unnecessarily expose people to something that's going to do them harm. I mean, look, if the Hippocratic Oath takes that pledge that I will never do anything to harm anyone, then certainly as a pastor, I'm not going to be so stiff-necked or so rigid that I'm going to unnecessarily expose people to harm. So it's just a simple question. It wouldn't have been any different if somebody said a hurricane is coming and a hurricane is headed this way. You need to send the people home. You need to get them in a place where it's safe. It was that kind of response. It was a very normal, common sense response until we could find out what the reality was.
Right. Those first 2 weeks when you locked down, We did streaming. What did you hate the most about those first 2 weeks?
Well, I don't like preaching to no one. Standing at the pulpit at Grace Community Church in a completely empty building that's supposed to have 3,000 people in it and talking to the empty pews is not it's not a wonderful experience by any stretch of the imagination. You feel like you're putting on some kind of performance rather than communicating in any kind of reciprocal way with a congregation of people that are engaged with you. So, yeah, it's the same reason I never wanted to do radio by sitting behind a desk and making a radio broadcast. When we decided to do radio, I said there's only one way I'd do radio, or for that matter, television, and that's if you take a sermon and put it on the radio, take a sermon and put it on the television. The only person who ever did that up until we did it was Billy Graham put his sermons on, and J. Vernon McGee put his sermons on the radio. And so we said, they're nothing but sermons. I don't want to sit in a room with a desk and try to teach the wall. That night when we came together on July 23rd and we had a document, this was our moment to take a stand. This is our document. This is where we stand. And this was a kind of a covenant as elders of Grace Community Church to not allow the headship of Christ to be usurped by the federal government. And that is exactly what happened on that same day when the Anglican prelate came to try to subsume the whole Scottish church under Anglicanism and under the authority of the king. And they decided, too, that they would take their stand with a document. And as a result of England's pressure on them to conform, they produced what became known as the National Covenant. And the people who signed that covenant became known as the Covenanters. And the next, really, I think you could go as many as 40 years, was a very difficult time for Scotland. First of all, the English took these preachers who signed this, and basically they threw them out of the church. There were executions, there was martyrdom, they were burning people at the stake. Pastors were meeting in what they called conventicles, out in the wilderness, in the cold and the rain. And that part of Scottish history is one of the most magnificent times of believers taking a stand. There was a particular leader that has always fascinated me by the name of Richard Cameron. He was one of those Scottish pastors who was faithful, and on one particular occasion there was a knock on his door, and some people showed up and they had a box for him, and they gave him the box, and he opened it, and in it he saw his son's hands. And there's a great recording of written document of the fact that he said, "Those are my son's hands, my own dear son's hands." And to put pressure on Cameron, they had basically chopped off his son's hands. That happened, and I think later in his case, his son lost his head as well. So they were trying to intimidate a guy who was really at the top of, or one of the main guys taking the stand. So out of that national covenant came martyrdom, and also came the need to clarify who's the head of the church, because that was the issue. Sometimes theological issues like the head of the church are not assaulted, they're not attacked, and so they're not refined. But when people start to be thrown out of their churches, when people start to be executed because they affirm Christ as the head of the church, then what that means gets crystallized. And through church history, many doctrines were crystallized in life and death situations. And Christ, the head of the church, was definitely that. I mean, there were lots of believers at the time who would say, yeah, Christ is the head of the church, but they wouldn't have expected that for that doctrine, somebody would have to shed his blood. And so I've often said the headship of Christ over his church has basically sailed down to this modern generation on a sea of blood, much of it the blood of the Covenanters.
And here we are, there are people that are laying down because of convenience. how does that make you feel when you look at the price the Covenanters paid over all those years and how we're handling it today?
Yeah, what people once believed and correctly believed was absolutely critical truth. Christ is the head of the church. They believed it so strongly that they would give their lives for it, that they would die for it, men and women and even children. And now there are people who don't even think about Christ as the head of the church. They don't even acknowledge the theology of that. And they're happy to accept some usurper, some quasi-supposed pastor who's put himself in the place of Christ, and they think nothing of it. And because somebody has already taken the place of Christ, it's not a shock to them when the government takes the place of Christ. You know what I'm saying? They're once removed already from the headship of Christ. And so it's an easy step to say, oh, well, that's fine. We're not going to fight this. You know, in de facto terms, you've already abandoned the headship of Christ. So it's an easy step from some guy who's taken over as if he's the head of the church to the government doing the same thing.
Yeah. You mentioned the conventicles and them going through the rain and going out into the forest, and the weather's not good in Scotland, at least as far as our Southern California standards are. And church was clearly important to them, to where they not only were risking their lives by attending, they were risking the elements to get there, and the uncomfortableness and the inconvenience of it. And parallel that conventicle experience with what happened during the lockdowns and coronavirus.
You know, when the Scottish people went out into what they called the conventicles, out in the hillsides and the moors and the woods to meet, they were escaping persecution, but they were in a very, very harsh and difficult climate. And it was a kind of climate outdoors that contribute to sickness. We would understand that that would be the place in the cold of winter where you would be susceptible to every virus, every germ that was circulating among those people. And, you know, without the pathology in those days to even understand illness, knowing that many people got sick, many people were seriously ill, and people died during the difficulty of those years, you have to appreciate that neither political authority nor the threat of illness could stop the church from being the church and meeting together. And they also understood that they didn't have to have a public meeting for non-believers to come, because the church is the gathering of the redeemed. And they needed that for the sake of edification and fellowship and mutual ministry. But yeah, they welcomed a certain exposure to illness in the elements by even going to gather in those very harsh times. So it was a threat, much like the COVID threat. You could say even at the outset was a government threat on the one hand that sent people away from the church, but it was also the fear of collecting each other's diseases that sent people away from the church. Doesn't seem like the people in the conventicles thought about that very much.
What did you think our chances were in that moment?
I don't think I ever thought about what our chances were. In one sense, I didn't really care whether we won or lost the case, because we wouldn't do any different either way. If we had lost the case, we wouldn't have done any different. I even said to the people, if they decide to throw me in jail, so be it. But we're going to stay right where we are. So I didn't really think about winning or losing the case, partly because I was never in the court. Through the entire litigation, nobody really from the church was in on those hearings. It was our attorneys, or Jenna Ellis, and the attorneys for the city, the county, or the state, and we were never there. So in a sense, it protected us from sort of feeling the pressure at a level we might have if we had to sit in the court and listen to the arguments. So we were never there, and so it was just clear cut in our minds that it doesn't matter how this thing turns out, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And that was actually a part of trusting the Lord, that if we were faithful, God would bring the outcome he desired, and whatever that outcome was, we were willing to face that, win or lose.
There were very few churches that actually took a stand like James and like us. Speak to that and how there's so very few workers who are willing to take the price that this conflict exposed.
One of the things that I thought was so interesting was all the mega churches shut down. All the supposed media pastors, the famous pastors, the guys that have the big mega churches with the massive crowds that are supposed to be the model pastors of the country, they all shut down their churches. There were lots of faithful churches that you don't know about that didn't happen in. But there were some that shut their church for 2 years in the middle of all of this. And I think it was a test of faithfulness, courage, resolve. And there were just a lot of guys that didn't pass the test. The information that I knew about the statistics with COVID was available to any of them. They could have taken a stand based upon their theology should have been that Christ is the head of the church and that he would protect his church, take a stand, and let him demonstrate his power and his faithfulness. But they didn't do that, which meant to me that there are other elements driving them than fidelity to Christ. And maybe that's not surprising because megachurches tend to downplay the role that Christ plays in the church and upplay the psychological benefits of church and the entertainment aspect of it and all of that. So if your church was not so Christ-dominated and Christ-centered and Christ-honoring and gospel-driven, but you were just trying to reach the world and you were trying to be a popular place and a cool place, it wasn't very cool to stay open. So in order to fulfill your motive, which was to kind of woo the world your way, you had to kind of follow their lead, which is what those megachurches all did. But if you're just following the script of Scripture, then you follow the Lord, and that's exactly what we did. And I think there were more churches that did that than you know about because they were small churches, and even meeting didn't bring a lot of public scrutiny.
How important was this trial?
This trial is vitally important to Grace Community Church because we won, and that establishes the freedom of our church to continue to meet. And it establishes not only for us, but for other churches as well, because it's precedent. So it's significant. And that's in the moment as we speak. But I think this trial was also important for the future, which is why we're making this documentary to demonstrate to future generations that are going to face the same thing, because they're not going to give up. They're not going to go away. This culture resents God, hates the truth. They're going to come after people who are faithful to the truth. And so we've got some history on our side. Here's a story of a faithful church that can act as a model, as an example for similar situations going on into the future, which is why I so much wanted to do this documentary. It isn't that we want to make heroes out of people at Grace Community Church. We were faithful. We just stuck by the biblical script. We had some tremendous help from attorneys who represented us. They did a great job. But in the end, the Lord was kind to us, gave us this victory, I think, to be an encouragement to other churches. And it's kind of fallen out that way. People have actually said to me, we're so glad you won the case because it gives us courage to take the same stand you took, the next time around.
How do you want this documentary to be used? What do you hope this documentary does?
I hope this documentary does several things. First of all, that it clarifies the church's response to the government, what it is permitted to do and what it's not permitted to do. That's really important because there's so much confusion about that. Secondly, it demonstrates the faithfulness of a congregation of people who've trusted in the Lord, took a stand to be faithful to Him, and how He responded to their faithfulness by the kinds of action that gave victory to His church. I think the Lord wants His church to triumph in the world. And that's what the Apostle Paul says, we always triumph in Christ. The church should never be the victim of the government. It should always triumph over all human institutions. And I hope this documentary will lead to a future where churches, having seen the testimony of what happened at Grace Church, will decide to be faithful to the Lord and see the triumph that can come with that faithfulness.